Welcome to the Climate Trends podcast. I'm Shreya Jai, and today's episode we are looking at a question that is becoming more urgent every summer. How is rising heat changing our energy demand, and what does that mean for India's power system? Joining us is Vishal Pandya, co founder and managing director of REConnect Energy, to help us understand the connection between heat, electricity use, grid stress, and the transition to a more resilient energy future. Welcome to the podcast, Vishal.
Thank you, Shreya. Good evening.
Thank you. Good evening to you too. And let's just quickly jump into the conversation because obviously this issue is very urgent. We've had discussions, we have heard you on several platforms talking about the link between heat, renewable energy, grid stress, and the need to tweak the technologies and policy to bring all these issues together. I'll just start with something that every listener would relate to, and that is India's peak power demand. It is reaching a new record every summer. We have already touched 270 gigawatt this year. I wanted to ask you to what extent is extreme heat driving these increases and how our consumption patterns are changing across different sectors because of this?
Yeah. Uh, Before we jump to the impact of heat, the supply side is what I would want to emphasize in terms of how the load pattern is changing. 5 years ago, if you notice, India would achieve its peak demand sometime around between 6 p.m. and 10 p.m. And it will vary between, say 7 p.m., 7:30 p.m., 8 p.m., and so and so. Over last 4 5 years, we have added a lot of solar, and the concentration of solar has been tremendous. Both the grid scale solar and also the distributed solar getting added in form of rooftops. This has led to a situation where the surplus scenario during daytime has become difficult to handle at the grid level, where a sizable chunk of energy gets produced during that point in time. The demand doesn't shift, and as a result, the peak hours in terms of energy supplied, the peak energy supplied has started falling between 12 p.m. to 3 p.m. window. So there is a inherent demand shift, or other supply that is catered to is being concentrated during solar hours. So this is the point number one. Point number two is the heat and demand has a massively non-linear situations. For example, when there is a winter, the night load where especially in the northern belt, the heating load becomes important ramp rate to manage for utilities like BSES in Delhi or Haryana or Punjab or discoms in UP. The thermal heat, on the other hand, works in a slightly different way. When average temperature is say 24, 25, people would be okay running fans. The AC load will not kick in. The moment temperature goes beyond 32, 33 degrees, the AC load starts kind of picking up, and beyond 40 again, it again becomes saturated, right? Because when you have AC, you will run the AC. Beyond that, you cannot do it. Just that you run it maybe at a slightly lower temperature again to offset the atmospheric heat. So there is a significant traction you see the moment, say, average temperatures in India start hitting above 37, 38 degrees at a national level. And there comes a massive spike in terms of energy demand. Given the urbanization, what we are also seeing is that a lot of concrete that we keep pouring onto the soil, it also acts as a thermal battery where the extreme heat during daytime also radiates back during night hours. So our cooling load also goes up substantially during night hours. And there what we also see is that while the peak of peak gets observed during daytime, the night hours are also substantially high because the demand hasn't gone away. And there comes, scenarios where the supply is short, the markets are facing the regulatory ceilings, which is 10 rupee a unit today, and utilities will scramble to kind of arrange power supply to meet the night hour demand.
Just connected to this, are there any particular regions or say consumer groups that are contributing most significantly to this trend? You mentioned AC and cooling. We are seeing a significant increase in residential cooling. People are setting up ACs. There has been an exponential rise in the number of ACs, not only in just urban areas but rural areas. So, can you quickly touch upon that? What are the trends we are seeing from consumption?
Yeah, I mean, fabulous question. The number of rooftops that we have added in last 4 5 years has been phenomenal. And after this PM Surya Ghar Yojana, the acceleration of rooftop has also been significant. The side effect of, or rather, the positive side effect of rooftop solar has been that when you add a rooftop of, say, 1 kilowatt or 2 kilowatt, you end up generating sizable surplus electricity for an average household, which used to go back to utilities at, say, 2 rupee or 2.5 rupee as a surplus energy, and you will get paid something. With the rising spending power across all Indian households, thanks to economic growth, that what we have seen, the consumer has become more demanding in terms of, understanding that why give away 2 rupee electricity? Why can't I put AC? And when I have one AC, if there is still surplus, I'll put more ACs in the house. And I have seen this case playing out quite substantially in pockets like Gujarat, Maharashtra to an extent where uh, the consumer will start with some, meaningful rooftop capacity. Then they'll realize that, oh, this is a lot of surplus going away in a much cheaper way. Let's add EV, system, EV charging system at home. Buy the electric vehicle. Your fuel cost goes down. You add more ACs. Your comfort level goes up, and then if needed, you add more solar. So, it runs into a very nice cyclical way where the affordability led to affordability driven by solar creates more affordability for other consumables like your cooling load and electric mobility and so on. So there you see kind of a spiral effect in terms of what happens to the supply side on rooftop and then the demand side as well. And the residential load at a India level, if we see aggregate level, we are about 24-25% in terms of national energy basket if you take electricity on a standalone basis, and this is quite substantial. So entire western belt, southern belt, which are where the population density is substantial, the temperature spike lead to a sizable residential cooling requirement, and the industrial requirement of course stays, and it also kind of peaks up the moment heat outside your premise is a lot higher, right? So there is a kind of a compounding effect that gets played out. And agriculture, which is about 18 to 20% of our national energy basket, with more heat you also need to protect your crop, and the irrigation requirement will also go up. And now large part of that is being met by the solar irrigation schemes under PM Kusum. There is some comfort around that. Yes, there is a substantial uptake in demand the moment temperature spikes above, say, 35-37 degrees, at an aggregate level.
Right. When we talk about heat waves, in terms of, public dialogue, there's so much of attention given to public health issues, but not enough on its impact on energy system. So from the angle of, say, a grid operator and utilities who are in the power supply chain, what are their biggest challenges when it comes to dealing with prolonged periods of extreme heat?
From the administration point of view, now of course we come from the point of view of an observer being involved in various power system eco-circles. What I have witnessed is that there is a lot of concern as well as equal degree of excitement when you see that the demand is going to spike. What magnitude and what point in time remains the two key questions for all the policymakers, be it Ministry of Power or Central Electricity Agency or Grid India, right? More so from the point of view of ensuring that can we handle that much demand, and can we keep making newer records year after years without compromising the reliability? The concern, of course, stays where how do you meet that demand? Will the transmission network support that? Because when the heat is rising, the transmission capability also kind of gets diminished to an extent, because the load carrying capacity of a transmission lines also will reduce. You need to keep more margin for the thermal aspect of load carrying capacity of a cable connecting to transmission towers. So that all of that needs to be factored in. What we have seen at a country level is we have been adequately able to meet the requirement. Of course, there are a lot of concerns that comes up, especially handling those extreme peaks, but we have not seen cases where there is like cascade tripping or serious impact on the grid management.
So, in the current system, are there any vulnerabilities that should concern you? Are there any lacunas that need to be like fixed immediately?
I would not call it lacuna. I would put it as a systemic constraint. The heat follows a solar cycle. So in a way, we have abundance of energy during those hours. So if your transmission is sorted, you will always be able to meet your peak demand during solar hours when the generation is at its peak. The demand also would be at its peak. The challenges come during night hours. That's where the, I would not call it congestion, but the load curtailment or load shedding may happen purely because you may not have adequate supply coming in. And there comes the role of battery energy storage system, BESS. India has auctioned to the tune of, I think, 30 plus gigawatt hours of storage. Not all of it is commissioned, or even part of it is commissioned. So until that, you know, storage element starts kicking in, the night hour constraints will still be a challenge for grid operators and discoms to handle in terms of how do you procure that power well in advance, ensure that there is a reliability aspect attached to the power supply, and the requirements of a consumers are met. So it's a constrained kind of environment, not a lacuna of the system. So that way, I mean, the heat and the solar cycle kind of complements each other.
Right, it absolutely does. But I'll go deeper on the supply side question. Cooling demand is expected to rise. There are numbers which show that there might be a significant increase in AC demand. And as you mentioned, with economic growth and with electrification, there is more ownership of electronic equipment. So it's not just cooling. We're looking at other equipment, allied equipment also to increase, and therefore the consumption will increase. But how then does the supply plan should happen? Because as much as renewable energy capacity is growing, there continue to be a reliance on fossil fuel. And so how can India plan to tackle this growing demand without locking itself into a fossil fuel dependence and the emissions?
Yeah, in terms of our energy mix, if you see, coal still carries a substantial kind of share, and that is going to stay for sizable number of years in times ahead. What has changed in last 5 to 10 years is the renewables, which was variable, which is considered variable form of energy, and the coal was considered as like a base load generating stations. The scenario has changed where large number of thermal power plants are expected to adjust according to the new reality, led by renewables, within renewables led by solar, and managed daily ramp up ramp down requirements subject to technical minimum. Right. And the technical minimum, which used to be 55%, now we are talking 45%, still under negotiations. So I think the dependence on fossil fuel will still stay. We have a very large grid. In terms of energy balance, we are still a tiny fraction of net energy coming from renewables, barring states like Karnataka, Gujarat to an extent, where a sizable chunk of energy in absolute term gets contributed from renewables. But rest of India is not there yet. So there, what is needed is, if you want to ensure that the renewable journey doesn't get halted, you also need corresponding storage levers. Now with a lot of solar coming in, you can back down thermal to an extent, but you still have a lot of surplus. What do you do about that surplus? Right now, the easiest option is you curtail, but then it sends a very, very negative signal to the investors. So only if at a grid scale you can store that energy, utilize during night hours, utilize for managing various ancillary services for grid management, there is a potential play there in terms of how a newer set of technology can complement India's energy transition journey. And gradually you will see that the coal will see a diminishing kind of contribution in terms of overall energy basket. If renewable grows at say 20-25% a year, coal may also grow to an extent, but the net contribution from coal in terms of percentage energy requirement would go down few decades down the line to a significant value, but it's a long journey.
Yes, absolutely. Before I move on to the renewable side of the equation, I also wanted to understand what role can energy efficiency play in this whole equation? Can you align, can, the system operators or consumers or the industry align energy efficiency measures with cooling technologies. We have seen the PAT scheme and star rating scheme, etc. Sorry, I mentioned PAT scheme wrongly, but the star rating scheme, which in itself is a success case on how do you have energy efficient equipment. How do these aligns with reducing demand and ensuring that our fossil fuel dependence doesn't rise?
There is a kind of sizable impact of the new age equipments that we have been putting in our households, in our industrial premises, starting with replacement of the bulbs and tube lights with CFLs. The Ujala scheme was a very fabulous success, followed by ESL-led significant drive replacing the water pumps used by urban local bodies, ULBs, replacing them with energy efficient pumps, and there was also an ROI. We have seen at a household level the effect what the Attenberg made in terms of the fans. While 2 to 2.5 times more expensive, there is a significant adoption of those BLDC fans across industrial units, across households, simply because they run longer, they consume much lesser energy, and the lighting load also has gone down substantially. And one of the reason why the evening peak doesn't shoot as higher as the day peak, because while the new establishments are coming up, the CFL has become like a default choice. No one buys the tube light anymore. They are all smps driven devices, hugely efficient, and every new iteration you get in those technologies are even more efficient. Like a 5 watt light bulb 10 years ago, 15 years ago, you will use it for like a dim light as a night lamp. Now that 5 watt or 10 watt is like a massively bright and very, very comforting to the eyes. So that's a difference. And industrial level also, the efficiency has played its own role, right? Especially on the heating requirement. So good number of industries have moved to solar heating as one of the primary input, where you replace the old energy driven heaters to solar heater, get your base energy input using that solar heating equipment, and you run your industrial process on top of it to kind of make your overall outcome a lot more energy efficient. And PAT scheme has played a sizable role there, putting mandate on the industries, a large number of industrial units, and then asking them to kind of trade those energy saving certificates and so and so. So overall, I mean, there is a significant impact. So while the economy continues to grow at between 7 to 8%, the energy doesn't grow beyond 6 7%, and the efficiency also has a play, kind of massive play there.
Right, absolutely. I'll go back to two things that you mentioned. One, how imperative energy storage is at the moment to, meet the evening demand and nighttime demand. And secondly, you said that it is solar power comes at a time when the power demand also peaks in. So they both kind of move in sync. But the gap there is in of energy storage. There have been plans, there have been policy push to energy storage, but for it to scale up to the level that solar has already reached would take time. Do you think that there are some more policy acceleration that energy storage requires? Second, how can the industry or the renewable energy industry or the whole supply chain adopt to energy storage more so as to increase the absorption of solar and renewable energy in general?
Two levers where I have seen the policy makers are actively pursuing. One is the flexibility, where I think 2 and a half years ago, MOP came up with a roadmap in terms of how the power market should be further designed, the role of renewables into mainstream power systems and power markets, along with flexibility. So you aggregate a lot of demand nodes, try to shift demand at a shorter notice, more of a active demand response. Bunch of utilities are currently conceptualizing what should be a standard bidding agreement, what should be the aggregation framework. Can we nudge the consumer to shift their demand, both the industrial, commercial, as well as the residential? The probability of hitting that pocket lies larger on the CNI pocket because they are commercially sensitive. They also have sizable load to kind of shift compared to a average Indian household, where the load which can shift would be restricted to not beyond AC and your heating load. Right. So this is lever number one. The other aspect from the policy making point of view, primarily to tackle demand, has been this whole Make in India campaign, where the battery energy storage a newer technology, especially for example sodium ion. Multiple other impetus is given where the newer technology could emerge. Even in LFP side, on the BESS, when you see, we still have a huge reliance on China, right? You bring components from there, you assemble here, you call it make in India. I mean, that's how the industry is operating at the moment. But that needs to change. And the dependency is where we are still struggling to meet our energy requirement through storage, simply because the rupee depreciates faster than the markets, right, compared to US dollar. So that raises your input cost. Second is, if China sneezes on, the policy side of battery energy storage, the cascading effect will happen not only in India but globally. Now, if your entire supply chain is driven by one large country, a neighboring country, you are bound to have, those ifs and buts in terms of you run reverse auction based tenders here, you award, you collect bank guarantees, but then when the project is not viable, not bankable, how will that see the day of light? So that remains a challenge.
Right. Thanks for addressing that. I'll now steer into some of the work that your company does. REConnect Energy, apart from doing so many things that you do, also works extensively with forecasting and energy analytics. You have done significant work in weather forecasting, demand forecasting, digital tools, marrying them all to, help utilities plan their energy systems, plan their energy sub procurement and everything. But how do these tools are helping these same utilities prepare for heat related demand surges?
Right. So, in terms of the supply and demand, so the heat and supply, there is not much of a challenge. The heat and demand is where you look at, like, peakiest of peak, and identifying those peak remains a challenge. Right. So, will the trend continue or not? And a country of the size of India, unless you go down at a district level and map the influencing factor causing spike in demand, you will not be able to get a very realistic sense on what's going to be the demand next day in terms of peak demand. Simply because you might have a cloudy region in southern peninsula, but scorching hit in Delhi and western belt, you will still have muted demand, right? And when we hit 270 gigawatt, the fortunate part there was we were tracking this very closely. A large part of Karnataka and Tamil Nadu were covered by dense clouds, and it was in fact raining in few pockets. Despite that, we hit 270. Had those clouds and rain not been there, the 270 could have become 275, 278. Right. So that's the kind of microscopic factors that affects what's going to happen at a national level. And those kind of tracking we have built in terms of understanding district level behavior, triangulating all the way to national level. Still a lot more work to be done in terms of what more intelligence you can gather out of it, but it's a massive kind of compute effort and modeling effort when it comes to micromanaging all these events and deriving an intelligence out of it through that plethora of data streams.
Can you give some example of any project that you have assisted with, which could, show us a good example on how, forecasting and prior planning improved grid performance and their supply and power supply reliability?
Right. I mean, bunch of examples like the renewable energy management centers that we have been running, and there are proven instances where even on a 2 3 day ahead basis, the trend is what you get to know. So the reliability of forecast has improved substantially, both on the renewable supply as well as demand. And the price forecasting also that we do gives you fair idea in terms of which are the pockets where price is going to go up. Price is a lot more volatile, but there is a predictability aspect around that. When we started renewable energy management centers, the general notion was that the forecast is there, we'll see what to do with it later. We go ahead with the procurement as if the renewable doesn't exist. Now we are at a stage where large number of utilities where we have worked with, they actively see what's going to be the forecast. The forecast goes into their day-to-day procurement planning with certain margin of error that they factor in. And now we have large number of statistical kind of parameters which can tell you, like a state like Karnataka, my average renewable forecast error would be about 125 to 150 megawatt on an intraday basis. Day ahead basis, it might be somewhere around 150 to 200 megawatt. On a grid on a renewable grid size of say 12 to 14 gigawatt, right? So it's not that the error doesn't happen, but you know that this is the margin you need to factor in either up or down, which still operates within the permissible deviation band for the state of Karnataka, which is I think 250 or 350 megawatt permitted by CERC. Same goes on the demand. Demand is where a lot more work is to be done in terms of mapping the assets, mapping. Today, most of the states, even now, they do a single vector demand forecast. In RE, we go at a plant level, we look at what is the plant's actual characteristic, map the weather for that plant, aggregate at a state level or regional level, and then the forecast happens. So it gets like, it captures a granular effect in terms of what's happening. And you aggregate these at a national level, the renewable forecast looks like a lot more stable, a planning grade forecast. Demand, on the other hand, if you take example of say Karnataka or Maharashtra or Gujarat, near 20 gigawatt peak. Maharashtra is almost 30 gigawatt peak. Gujarat is 25, 27 gigawatt peak. If you give only a single vector data and say, this is my demand profile, map everything to this profile, and now you do demand forecasting, you are still doing a lot of averaging out. What happens in Saurashtra or Kutch did not happen in Mehsana in Gujarat, or say, in the Surat belt in Dakshin Gujarat. So all of this, if you get a more granular data, the demand forecast can become a lot more robust. Today, 3.5% is the day ahead error that you are looking at on demand forecast. If you go deeper down, like the way we are doing for renewable, this can easily go under 2% on a day ahead basis. The data modeling has to, be a lot more comprehensive for that.
That's fascinating, and to know that there are so many technological advancement and changes happening at all levels of the supply chain, and how they can, a little change can go a long way into bringing a
Yes.
bigger shift in the energy supply system. But do you see climate change being a major factor in the energy planning across the supply chain? And if not, do you think that it will become a bigger variable than ever when it comes to countries' energy planning?
Very much. A resounding yes in terms of climate change being the factor, not only in your short term energy procurement, but also in a long term energy planning. The resource assessment that we do for wind and solar, what you typically do is you go back into the history 20 years, 30 years. There is a data set called MERA2, MERRA, which is a reassimilation data, which is considered kind of a, benchmark to understand macroscopic trend around where on earth, which point, in earth, what kind of resource between wind and solar is available. Right. The 20-year trend, you assume that this will continue. Now, that is not holding true. The 20-year average, you're going to look at a bumpy ride in between, and the periodicity of that bumpy ride has gone up. For example, until June, we were the western belt in India were trending about 40% deficit in monsoon. Come July, it's flooding in Maharashtra. Right. Now, your statistical average, your monsoon deficit may have improved, but the kind of flood that Maharashtra, especially Mumbai, has seen, again, a large part of Maharashtra may not have seen the rain, but the averages are still holding true, right? And this is what is happening in your resource availability, especially on the wind. So your 20-year average for say northern Karnataka near Chitradurga wind rich zone will convey that your average COF might be 19 or 20% at say 80-meter hub height. You might end up with a season where your typical wind season, you might either start late, and good number of times in last 10 years we have seen people come back and say April has come, wind season has started. But purely from the pattern analysis, I mean, the AI team will come back and say, according to the generation pattern, your wind season hasn't started. And sometime it goes back, all the way till like mid June, end June, and so and so. The El Nino effect, it's like, the global, what you can call it, bellwether in terms of what happens to heat and then what happens to the energy resources from renewable, especially wind. There again, there is a strong correlation. So a strong El Nino year will have weaker monsoon, you'll have weaker wind generation, And we have seen it this year as well, where the wind production has started very weak. Now there is some catch up that is being played. How long this will last? Again, it's difficult to kind of anticipate with a very, pinpointed accuracy. So climate remains the factor in terms of what's going to happen to your demand. The demand gets influenced massively not only by heat but also the amount of rainfall you get, because your agri load will also spike if there is no rainfall. 3 years ago, I think it was 2022, 2023, a year before, Karnataka had sold power worth of 2,800 crore surplus power. And it's a renewable rich state, massive hydro reserves, problem in handling renewable as a grid integration point of view. A year down the line, when there was a monsoon deficit, large part of Karnataka, it was deficit. The peak demand in summer went up by almost 20 or 25%, which was not anticipated at all. The state ended up buying a lot of power, losing, their available funds to meet the power demand. So this is how the balance sheet of entire discom can get distorted the moment you have a, strong or weaker monsoon. And same goes for the supply side equation, where if you have a high wind season, the wind is blowing good, sunshine, you don't see much of a variation other than dust and, other climatic, smaller climatic factors. But wind, you see a sizable volatility. So in your energy planning, if you factor that last year wind and last to last year wind was this year I'm expecting this much, balance is what I'll procure. If you are a wind rich state like Tamil Nadu or Karnataka, wind goes down by 20% or 25% at an aggregate level. That's a sizable deficit you will end up buying from market, which will be very, very expensive for you to handle at that point in time.
Oh no, it's quite surprising, and I think we have discussed this before as well, that the these green energy technologies which are put in place to tackle climate mitigation are themselves impacted by climate change.
Yes.
Wind has a significant wind faces a significant impact. Solar itself, because there have been instances of dust storms and thunderstorms, etc., which have come out of the blue, cloud cover, which have not been forecasted for, and that impacts the solar production in itself. So it's quite ironical, but I think that is the truth. But do you think that there, the amount that how these challenges are compounding in themselves, are the policies and infrastructure investments keeping pace with the scale of the challenge and how complex it is becoming?
See, the complexity exists. The complexity has always existed, right? What needs to be done is factoring these complexities and the risks associated with that into a financial planning, right? Now, if you assume that the 20-year trend for solar will continue, it's a fair assumption. But when you build your financial projections, you create a best possible scenario and say that the best of 20 years, the best 5 years of 20 years is what you are projecting for next 20 years. There you are likely to go wrong, right? Not factoring the climate change, same goes for wind, right? One good year, you are down 20-25% in your production, your revenue is down by that much percent. How will you fund your debt? How will you fund the balance of cash flows? So this all ties back to the degree of planning that a developer can look at. Unfortunately, I mean, there is a massive competition in winning the tenders. The reverse auction is what we are fond of, right? I mean, I wish as a stakeholder, if a simple L1 method is applied in terms of bidding, potentially it can, bring some stability in terms of that factor of safety. People can start kind of building it, right? So today, I mean, as an observer, again, we do not have any operating assets, but what we see is that the availability for grid is assumed to be near 100%, which is not going to be true for most of the assets, not only in India, but also in countries like China, Australia, US, pockets like California, where there are RE rich states. The grid availability during solar hours is always going to be restricted. There is never going to be enough demand coming during solar hours, right? And this is a like a, you know, trying to fit physical constraints that you can have in the system. You don't factor that, you do not, or rather, you overlook the climate change and presume that the best of the scenarios will hold true for us, which doesn't happen, right? So good number of developers, they come back to us saying whatever we projected during projections, the actuals never match, and it's always trending on the lower side. There have been no, either insignificant or no instances where your wind resource assessment projections will hold true in real world. So the M&As also kind of, sometime gets stalled or the valuations gets calibrated, because what you project 2 years down the line or 3 years down the line, the actuals you compare, you're trending significantly different than what one projected for.
Right. At this point, I have a very interesting question, which is, this whole conversation has been interesting, but this is a little, a different question. Is that if you were advising policymakers, city planners, and energy companies, one priority action to better prepare for a hotter future, what would it be and why?
I mean, better prepare for hotter future. I'll start with perhaps in a completely opposite direction. Improve the urban planning, because the entire heat and the effect of heat into national demand and power system is a function of how our urban planning has been, or how poor our urban planning has been, right? You need a lot of green spaces all over the city. We started with putting those tar based roads. Now we have moved to concrete. I mean, there is no way the water, whatever small rainfall you get in a city, the water can get absorbed and the water table kind of be maintained. So we are completely going against the fundamentals in terms of how the urban development has been shaping up, not only in India but maybe most of the parts of the world. We need to carve out a dedicated space for the greenery to thrive, and that alone can bring the temperature down substantially. We start from there, and of course there are technologies to kind of handle and nurture, like pump storage and battery energy storage. Solar is here to stay. Hopefully we'll live in an era where there are no fossil fuel based productions coming anymore. Pretty much entire forms of energy is coming from renewable sources, right, in form of electricity and in form of other sources including heat perhaps, but we are, I think, still another 2 3 decades away.
Yes, but I think the planning starts now. And that was a fantastic point about urban city planning. And I think to a certain extent, how rural areas should plan as well, given that their electricity demand is rising. But definitely, new city planning, existing city planning need to factor in all these things where, because guess, I think that they are interlinked, as we, learned from this interaction, that heat resilience, climate action, energy demand supply planning, all are interlinked and each plays such a significant role in that. Thank you so much. That brings us to the end of this conversation on heat and energy demand. A big thank you to you, Vishal, for joining us and
Thank you
sharing
so much,
such
Shreya.
important insight.
Thank you, it's been a pleasure and a great conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you. If you found this episode useful, do subscribe to the Climate Trends podcast and stay tuned for more conversations on climate, energy, and the changing realities of a warming world.